You guys ever been lost before? Has anyone ever gotten lost? We've talked about being lost here before, but even if it was just like a little bit. I remember like as a kid, maybe you did the same thing. Like you're at the store with your parents and you're looking at the toy that you wish you had the money to buy, and you're just reading all this stuff again, and you turn around and your parents are gone, and you're like, man, where'd they go? And you kind of step out the aisle, you don't see them. My dad made it a game. He was like, well, you should pay attention, and he'd just drive home. No, I don't think he ever left me at the store completely, but he would just go and just hide. And he would like see where I'm wandering, and he'd wander back. And it was a little game we played. It gave me a lot of anxiety. It was great. Right, but what have you guys ever been lost at like an amusement park or like a big shopping center or something, and you're trying to get to like this certain store, this certain ride, and you're just like, man, I have passed this place 3 times, and I don't know. But you come across like the map kiosk, you know, that tells you all the things. Nowadays, it's like you open the app and it tells you where you're at. But maybe for those who are a little bit older, I always loved the places that had like the 3D model out on it. You know, I always thought those were cool as a kid. But there's always this little arrow, right, or a star or something that says, you are here. When you're lost and you find a map, right, you may find some comfort in knowing, okay, that's the place I want to go. This is where I walked in. But unless you know where you are, you're not going to be able to figure out where to go, right? And that you are here arrow star thing is really the most important part of that map to start with. If you guys are brand new here, maybe you haven't learned yet, but I really love being outdoors, hiking, biking. I really love backpacking, and I want to get as far away from civilization as I can, and I just head out there really far. And often that takes me on trails that not very many people walk on, and so they're kind of barely there, or, you know, I keep going farther, so I keep passing all these different crossroads of the trail and things. And knowing how to use a map is very helpful in a lot of those situations, but only if I can find where I'm at. If you've ever taken a map skill class, how many of you guys have ever taken map skill? How many of you guys are on a waiting list to take a map? Okay. Well, anyways, let me tell you a little bit of map skill class, okay? The first skill, after they tell you how to just understand what's on the map, the first skill they teach you is how to find where you are on the map, right? Because without knowing where you are at, the map is really not helpful at all. And there's many, many times that I've read my map too quickly, or I pulled it out and I thought I had it oriented the right direction, but I was looking at it turned or upside down, and I take a wrong turn. And like I remember one time on a super long day of hiking already, I looked at the map real quick, came to a crossroad, and was like, oh, yep, need to take a right here, and walked about 1.5 miles and was like, this has been the wrong direction for sure this whole time. Pull out the map. Sure enough, I needed to go like 0.1 mile farther to the next crossroad. So I had to walk back. So I had to walk back my 1.5 miles and just to get back to where I had already been. And that's really frustrating. When you're driving, 1.5 miles is not too bad. When you're walking, that was like a full hour out of my day that I didn't get anywhere. But to be honest, you know, nowadays I don't really pull out a paper map very often. I pull out the GPS map on my phone, and I can quickly see my little dot that tells me where I'm at. It even has an option to like show you the direction that you're pointed, and it saves me a lot of time. And like 90% of the time, it's pretty accurate. Now, I don't think we get lost as much anymore because of that, right? I mean, when's the last time you guys used like a paper atlas map to like travel somewhere? Right, I use them because I think it's fun. On a guy's trip every year, we've been using it. But right, you just open up your phone, you just say, take me to wherever, and it figures out where you're at and where to go and sends you on your way. But we do, however, often get lost inside of us. Right? We don't really know where we are. Right? We don't know how we feel or why we're feeling how we feel. We don't often have the language to explain it. We don't understand the skills that we need to understand who we are. We don't know how to get help or where to go. And usually we end up more lost because we just keep cycling around. Or we're trying to avoid how we feel, and we don't really know how to get around it. So we're starting a new series today called the Atlas of the Heart. And we're going to be looking at these different emotions that we experience throughout life. And the goal really isn't just to learn about them. We don't want to just know about them. It's to learn what takes us there so that we can recognize when our you are here arrow is pointed at this emotion so that we can figure out where God would want to take us from there. Because I think we often wander through life and we don't really know where we're at And God has a place for us to go, but we don't understand how to get there because we have never stopped for a moment to really assess where we're at in life. And so we're going to look at all these different emotions and see where we are at and what we do when we find ourselves in these types of places so that God could take us to where he has for us. We're going to be going through the book by Brene Brown called Atlas of the Heart. Surprise. And it's, I just think, a great guide on how she structures emotions. And but before we get into this message, in our previous series, we talked about the 5 skills of ruler. And with the 5 skills of ruler, we can recognize, we can understand, we can label, we can express, and then we can regulate our emotions. I believe that we're going to need these 5 skills to be able to navigate the atlas of our heart. So if you missed that message back from May 19th, I highly recommend going back and watching that message and or listening to it on our podcast, on YouTube or Facebook, because it's going to really help you to understand how to navigate and recognize where we're at today. Now, there are many times when I open up my GPS app or I pull out a map and I have to remember those skills, right? My app's not working, so I got to read the skill around it. In the backcountry, you use what they call a topographical map. It shows elevation and the waterways. It shows whether it's foresty or rocky or marshy, along with the trails on there. And you have to have the skills of understanding what the map says to be able to look around you in real life and pinpoint where you're at. And I believe that the ruler skills are kind of what we need to be able to do that. So make sure you go back and listen to that if you haven't. Now, today we're going to be focusing on the places we go when things are uncertain or things are too much. And now we're going to be starting with the story of Elijah found in 1 Kings. So if you have your Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Kings 18. I don't hear very many pages turning. I hear some apps swiping, maybe. I don't know. But so some background to Elijah in 1 Kings. 1 Kings is a book of the Bible that's in the Old Testament. This is before Jesus came to earth and died and rose again for our sins. And Elijah was a prophet. And that word prophet almost directly translates to God's mouthpiece. In other words, God would speak through Elijah to his people. And just like people today, they weren't always good listeners back then. Sometimes they chose to follow their worldly desires and worldly things instead of God and his word. And that's kind of where we find Elijah at this point. And we're going to start in 1 Kings 18. There's some other pieces of his life, but that's where we're starting today. And then so 1 Kings 18, verse 1 says, "Later on in the 3rd year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, 'Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain.' So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. Meanwhile, the famine had become very severe in Samaria. So Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. Now Obadiah was a devoted follower of the Lord. Once when Jezebel is Ahab's wife, King Ahab, once when Jezebel had tried to kill all the Lord's prophets, Obadiah hid 100 of them in 2 caves. He put 50 prophets in each cave and supplied them with food and water. Now Ahab said to Obadiah, 'We must check every spring in the valley of the land to see if we can find enough grass to save at least some of my horses and mules.' So they divided the land between them. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself. Now Obadiah was walking along, and he suddenly saw Elijah coming towards him. Obadiah recognized him at once and bowed low to the ground before him. 'Is it really you, my lord, Elijah?' he asked. 'Yes, it is,' Elijah replied. 'Now go and tell your master, Elijah is here.'" Okay, we're going to stop there for a second and give some more background. If you go all the way back to 1 Kings 16, 2 chapters before, you find the reason that they've been in a drought, and that reason is King Ahab. He was an evil king of Israel. Israel was God's people, but Ahab was ruling it in an evil way. Not only was he doing wrong things, but he stopped worshiping the one true God, and he started worshiping false gods that his wife Jezebel worshipped. That was the god of Baal and Asherah poles, and he built a temple, he built an altar and a shrine and all this stuff for the false gods. Verse 33 of 1 Kings 16 says this about King Ahab. It says, "He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the kings of Israel before him." Right? That's something I definitely don't want said about me. It's probably on his tombstone, and that's a bummer. But 1 Kings 17, next verse, it says, "Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe of Gilead, told King Ahab, As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Right? To prove that God was the true God, God held back rain for years. So now, back to the current moment of the story we were in, God is now sending Elijah 3 years later to tell Ahab it's going to rain. Ahab and his believing servant Obadiah, they were searching for water and grass and things, all in their nation to use selfishly. It wasn't like, we got to save our people. The King Ahab was like, we got to save my horses. And Obadiah runs into Elijah. So verse 16, 1 Kings 18, says, so Obadiah went to tell Ahab that Elijah had come. And Ahab went out to meet Elijah. And when Ahab saw him, he exclaimed, so is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel? Elijah replied, I've made no trouble for Israel. You and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who are supported by Jezebel. So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and all the prophets to Mount Carmel. So Elijah stood in front of them and said, how much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, then follow him. But the people were completely silent. So if you guys were at VBS, you heard Victoria do this story with fun animals and all sorts of things. But Elijah sets up a showdown, right? And we're going to summarize this because this isn't the part of the message that matters too much today, but we need the background of it. Right? He sets up this showdown. He tells the prophets of Baal and Asherah, you guys build an altar to your God. Put animals on it, prepare it for a sacrifice, but don't set it on fire. I'm going to do the same thing to the one true God, and then we're going to see whose God is real. We'll say, God, if you're real, come consume this with fire. And so they set it all up, and the prophets of Baal and Asherah, they're praying and they're crying out, and for this fire to come and consume their sacrifice, and nothing happens. Elijah's actually, just as much as he's witty with his troublemaker statement against King Ahab earlier, literally he's like, I think your God's going to the bathroom. And he's literally how it translates over. He's like, he's probably busy. He's probably peeing or pooping, scrolling on his phone and not listening to you. But so he doesn't show up, and so Elijah's like, all right, my turn. And before he even starts to pray, he's like, you know what? I have so much faith that my God is going to answer this prayer. How about you go and gather 12 large jars of water and just cover the sacrifice? And they actually dug a trench around it, and there was so much water that was dumped on top of it that the trench around the altar was full of water. And they got to remember, they were in a drought. This is probably the water that Ahab had for his horses, and now they're just dumping it on this thing because this matter of which God will they serve is so important to them. And Elijah had so much faith that God was going to send rain, that he didn't care whether the water was wasted, quote unquote, in this way. So Elijah prayed, and the fire of God came down from heaven, consumed the sacrifice, consumed the altar, and all of the water that was around it was all dried up. So that's where we find ourselves in verse 39. It says, when the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground, and they cried out, the Lord, he is God. Yes, the Lord is God. So Elijah commanded them, seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape. So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley, and he killed them there. Then Elijah said to Ahab, go get something to eat and drink, for I hear a mighty rainstorm coming. Right? I mean, it hasn't rained for 3 years. And he's like, there's a mighty rainstorm coming. Ahab's like, all right, I'll go get something to eat and drink. It says, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel. He bowed low to the ground, and he prayed with his face between his knees. Then he said to his servant, go out and look towards the sea. The servant went and looked, returned to Elijah and said, I didn't see anything. 7 times Elijah told him to go and look. And the 7th time his servant told him, I saw a little cloud about the size of a man's hand rising from the sea. Then Elijah shouted, hurry up to Ahab and tell him, climb into your chariot and go back home. If you don't hurry, the rain will stop you. As soon as the sky was black with clouds, a heavy wind brought terrific rainstorm, and Ahab left quickly for Jezreel. Then the Lord gave special strength to Elijah. He tucked his cloak into his belt, and he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to the entrance of Jezreel. Right, that's crazy, okay? Anybody watch the Olympics? Did you guys even know the Olympics were going on? Do you guys know the story of Cole Hawker, the guy who was like a 31 odds, like he wasn't, it's surprising he even made it into the race for the 1500 meter, but he ended up winning it. There was he beat the Olympic champion from last Olympics. He beat the reigning world champion. It was supposed to be this crazy showdown between those two. The camera was literally zoomed in on those two, and this guy's passing them and wins. And that was Elijah and Ahab in his chariot. Ahab's just like, "Go, horses, go," and looks over, and Elijah just waves and runs on by. I don't know how it all worked, but it was crazy. Anyway, so 1 Kings 19:1 says, when Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way that he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel, this is Ahab's wife, sent this message to Elijah. May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as they have killed them. Elijah was afraid. He fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, the town in Judah, and he left his servant there, and he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree, and he prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." Right, so this story, all the bad guys are dead. He just killed them all in that valley of Kishon. The nation of Israel just saw God move mightily, and they all of them who weren't the prophets decided, yes, God is the true God. We're going to believe in him. Ahab went home. He cried to his wife, "Elijah took all my prophets and just did all this stuff," and just upset, right? And Elijah, he's done some of the most amazing things ever, right? He just called down fire from heaven, consumed this thing. He just ran faster than a chariot. But now he's overwhelmed. He wants to die under a broom tree, where we get most of our brooms today. And right, so this brings us to where we go when things are uncertain or things are too much. Right? One of the first places we often go is that we find ourselves stressed or overwhelmed. Right? We feel stressed when we evaluate the environmental demand as beyond our ability to cope successfully. Right? This includes moments of unpredictability, uncontrollability, and feeling overloaded. Right? Stressful situations cause physical, emotional, and mental reactions. Right? But however, regardless of how strongly our body is responding to stress, right? This is normally you have an increased heart rate or the cortisol release. Right? Our emotional reaction is more tied to our assessment of whether we can cope with the situation than how our body is actually feeling. Right? Most of us thought our emotions were reacting to our body when we feel stressed, but it's actually the other way around. Your emotions are responding to how well you think you can handle something, and then your body begins to follow suit to try and help you get through that situation. Now, navigating stress is an everyday part of life. There's not a life that is stress-free. They've actually shown in studies that a low amount of stress is actually really good for us. It helps us to accomplish great things. The cortisol that stress releases into our body is actually to help us focus so we can achieve whatever we need to get through. So for you professional procrastinators out there, when you blame procrastination on the fact I just focus better and I do better work last minute, that's actually true scientifically, so you can use that as an excuse. I'm probably not the best choice all the time, but it is true. Now, while lower levels of stress have shown to be good for us, the continuous perceived high stress levels have been proven to lead to a whole bunch of unhealthy things, decreased immune function, aging, less sleep, poorer health behaviors, and more. Just a lot of bad things come from perceived high stress levels. Right? And so what I want you to learn here is that the "you are here" arrow pointing at stress for you is when you believe that the things in your life are more than you can handle well. Right? When you start to feel like, I don't think I can handle all the things in front of me very well, you are stressed. But it hasn't reached a place where you can't handle it at all. That's a different emotion. Right? If you have reached the inability or the near inability to function because of stress, right? Because you perceive, which is a key word in both of these, you perceive you cannot handle. Most of the time, you actually can handle the situation, that's in front of you, right? That you're stressed or overwhelmed about, but you perceive you cannot handle it or cope with it, those things in your life, if that leaves you feeling unable to do anything, you are now overwhelmed. That's different than stress. Overwhelmed from the Webster Dictionary is completely overcome or overpowered by thought or feeling. Right? It's really easy for us to look at someone else's life and not understand why they're overwhelmed. Right? Because often from our outside perspective, we are not overcome by whatever their thinking process is. We're not overcome by whatever they're feeling because they're in it. So we look at people who are overwhelmed sometimes and we're like, it's not that hard, right? Just move on, get through it. I think, though, we all know a feeling that we've had at some time that washes over us, that just leaves us completely unsure of what to do next. Right? You've ever been there? People are like, well, what can I do to help? What needs done? And you're like, I can't even come up with an answer right now. You're probably overwhelmed. Right? Usually at that point, the only collected thought I can respond with is, if I knew what needed done, I would be doing that. Right? Just me? Okay. I often looked at Elijah in 1 Kings 19 for a long time, just really confused. Right? How does this guy who just called down fire from heaven, who prayed for rain, and now there's a storm coming, right? Who years ago prayed for rain to stop, and it had been dried up for 3 years, right? And who in 1 Kings 17, which we skipped over, he was being miraculously provided for with food for that whole drought. A bird was delivering food for him. There was a widow that he lived with who had literally nothing in a jar, but there was just enough to make food every day, and it never ran out through this whole drought. He actually raised that widow's son from the dead. He ran faster than a horse chariot 1 day before this. How does that guy end up afraid of some woman after he just killed all of her servants? How does that guy get to a place where he can no longer function and just says, I would rather be dead? Now, I've had some life experience, and I'm like, I get where he comes from. I wish I had a broom tree. I stress about buying brooms a lot. But after being there a few times myself, I think he was just really overwhelmed. Because all the Bible heroes that we look at who did all these amazing things were just humans like us. Right now, if some woman was telling, like, that the wife of a king was like, I'm going to kill you, I'd be afraid. I don't care what happened. I'd be like, that woman's crazy. Right? He's got access to everything. Right? I ran faster than a chariot once, but I don't know if I can run faster than 2 chariots. Right? And you just start thinking of all the things. Right? And if we look at verse 10, we see what's going on in Elijah's head. Actually, we'll start in verse 9. It says, but the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah replied, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. And God completely ignores him. You guys have probably never been there either. Verse 11, he just says, go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And now as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah, like all of us, was like, didn't you hear me the first time? So he replied again, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty. Right? But the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you. They torn down the altars. They killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. Then the Lord told him, go back the same way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram, and anoint Jehu, grandson of Nimshi, to be king of Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from the town of Abel-Meholah, to replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes from Hazael will be killed by Jehu, and anyone who escapes Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I will preserve 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal or kissed him. Do you see how Elijah's caught in this spiral of his own perception of what's going on? He can't even see how powerful God is right in front of him. God's like, look, you're scared, but look, I can make wind that blows mountainous rocks around. I can cause an earthquake. I can have fire. I can do all of these things. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he's like, well, there's this thing going on, and it's just like really overwhelming. I can't figure it out. And he's stuck in what he is perceiving life around him to be. He can't even see God's truth in front of him because he was overwhelmed. When all you can do is think in circles and you can't get yourself to act, even at a point that maybe God himself can't even speak that truth into you, that "you are here" arrow is pointing at overwhelmed, right? Or a minimum high stress. Again, this doesn't even need to be true events happening in your life. You probably, and most likely, and for sure because of God, can handle everything that you need to do in that situation. You just perceive that you cannot. Right? We also need to help understand this so we can help other people when we see them overwhelmed. Right? Don't come into that situation and say, "What do you need? How can I help you?" And start asking them all these questions. They don't know. So what do we do when we find ourselves there? Because I don't believe God wants us living there in that spot of life. He really wants us to be in a moment of peace, in a spot of peace in life. And so how did God handle Elijah? Well, if we look at verse 5, right, this is after he just prayed, I want to die, I don't want to be here. It says, "Then he lay down and he slept under the broom tree. And as he was sleeping, the broom thing. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, 'Get up and eat.' So he looked around, and there beside his head was some baked bread on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and he drank and he lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, 'Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you.' So he got up and he ate and he drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, where he came to a cave and he spent the night." Right, and this is then where God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But God recognized that Elijah was overwhelmed. The first thing he did for him wasn't, "You know what you're supposed to be doing, get out there and do it." Right? The first thing he didn't show up and go, "Stop being overwhelmed, trust that I'm God, and go and do what you're supposed to do." The first thing he did, he let him have a nap and a snack. Right? And we find that funny because it is, but it's real. When you are overwhelmed, you cannot make good decisions. You cannot figure out what to do first. What you need to do is rest, eat some food, right? If anything good has ever come from Snickers, is that we learned that you're not you when you're hungry, right? But that's real, right? Maybe there's so much that happens because we haven't taken care of our bodies physically. Right? I mean, Elijah he was living through this drought. He was searching through the desert to find King Ahab. He went up on the mountain, did all this stuff. He was praying. Like, he was completely sucked dry of anything that was going to give him life. And God recognized that because our physical bodies are real and need to be cared for. And so sometimes when you are overwhelmed, most of the time, you just need to rest. Right? Someone just messaged me, "Man, I'm feeling really overwhelmed about some things coming up in my life." And I was like, maybe you just need to put that on pause and go to sleep. Eat some food, go to sleep. Right? How many times have you really stressed about something happening the next day, and you finally fell asleep, and you woke up the next day, and it wasn't stressful at all? It's like easy peasy lemon squeezy day. Right? That happens majority of the time because it's our perceived stuff, not the real stuff in front of us, and we just need to rest. Give our mind a break. Studies show that the cure for being overwhelmed or living at high stress is mindful play. Just going out and doing something that you enjoy. Right? Having no agenda or just non-doing time. Right? Elijah went and took a 40-day vacation in the mountains. Right? I'm taking one next week. No, but maybe you can't go take a long vacation like that, but maybe you do need a vacation. Maybe you really actually need to take care of this body that you have and eat healthy and make sure you're getting adequate rest. What you definitely don't need at that time is to be pulled into a conversation about how you're overwhelmed and being asked how you should fix that or explain how you feel. And we need to remember that for each other because we will all feel overwhelmed at times and we need to be there for them appropriately. And the appropriate response to that is, let's go do something that you enjoy. Can I send you to a place where you can get some rest? Can I take some of those stress things off of your hands for a moment so that you can go and sleep? Right? That's the appropriate response to one another when we are overwhelmed. The big learning here in this is that feeling both stressed and overwhelmed is about our narrative of our emotional and mental depletion. Right? We perceive there's just too much going on to be able to manage it effectively. So we need to take a break. We need to pause for the things that overwhelm us. We don't quit them. Right? We don't just give up on it because it's hard. That's not what God did. God actually told Elijah, we're going to get there in a moment more, but we already read it, that to just go back and do what you're called to do. But first, he needed a break. He needed to rest. He needed that pause. Another place we can go when things get uncertain or things are too much is anxiety. Have you guys ever heard of anxiety? How many of you guys have seen the Inside Out 2, the new one? Great movie about emotions, especially anxiety. Go see it or see it when it comes out. You should definitely watch it. But Brene Brown compares anxiety to the scene in the original Willy Wonka. She refers to it as the Willy Wonka crap tunnel. Anybody know what scene I'm talking about just by saying that? Right, they're like rowing down a stream, and all of a sudden things start picking up pace. It gets really dark. Weird things start like flashing on the screens around them. It's like a millipede crawling on someone's face, a chicken getting his head cut off, a lizard like eating a bug. Right? Anxiety feels kind of like that. It makes no sense. It's a little bit chaos. Things seem completely unnecessary. And on top of all of this river craziness going on, Wonka is just repeating this poem. He's like, there's no earthly way of knowing which direction we are going. There's no knowing where we're rowing or which way the river's flowing. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is a hurricane a-blowing? Not a speck of light is showing, so the danger must be growing. Are the fires of hell a-glowing? Is the grizzly reaper mowing? Yes, the danger must be growing, for the rowers keep on rowing, and they're certainly not showing any signs that they are slowing. I get anxiety reading that. To me, I feel like that is a great explanation of anxiety. If you look it up in the dictionary, it should just be a YouTube clip of that scene. Right, the escalating loss of control, worst case scenario thinking and imagery, total uncertainty about what's going on. That is anxiety. The writer Elizabeth Gilbert wrote this about anxiety. She says, you are afraid of surrender because you don't want to lose control, but you never had control. All you had was anxiety. To me, I think this sums up most of anxiety for the Christian. And this doesn't mean that we won't experience anxiety. I don't want you to hear that today. We're talking about it because we will experience it, and you need to recognize when you are there. Right? We strive to hold on to control of our life so much that we end up with anxiety because we aren't in control. God is in control. And so all we end up holding on to is the anxiety of trying to be in control. The American Psychological Association defines anxiety as an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. The "you are here" arrow for anxiety is when you're tense and you're worried about future things that have not happened yet and may not ever happen. In all these studies of anxiety over the last few years, they found that there's kind of in two forms. We have a general state of anxiety and then the trait of anxiety. That means that some of us feel anxious mainly in just response to situations, and others can be naturally more predisposed to anxiety. They already kind of live at a level of anxiety because it's a trait in them, while some of us just experience it as we go. Now, if you're an Enneagram 6, if you're taking that test, we do it as part of our growth track, but you tend to be more predisposed because you tend to be aware of how every situation could turn out badly. It's part of what the 6 is aware of, how things could go wrong, and so they're more cautious about life. And that can lead to worry and anxiety that's really unnecessary. Now, so if you're a 6, or even if you're a 5 or a 7, because 6 would be one of your wings, you should be aware that you might be more predisposed to anxiety and worry, right? Don't worry about that. It's just who you are. But listen to this, approximately 1/3 of US adults, which actually happens to be the approximate population of 5, 6, and 7s. I think I just became a scientist. But 1/3 of US adults will be affected by an anxiety disorder in their lifetime. However, it's estimated that fewer than half of those people will seek any type of professional help. It's very difficult to work through an anxiety disorder without any sort of professional help, right? God wants to help you through that. I believe that God can deliver and heal you of those things. But I also know that he's given us professionals that can help us too. And so sometimes if you're there and you're feeling anxiety about things and you don't feel like you can get away from it, you might need professional help, and that's okay, right? Sometimes I get hurt too bad physically that I can't fix it myself, and I have to go to a doctor. And nobody frowns upon that. They all understand that. And sometimes mentally, things hurt too bad, and you can't fix it yourself, and you need to go to a doctor, and we don't frown on that, all right? It's what you do. It's what you should do, all right? And so if that's you, go there with boldness and understand I'm making the best decision for my life right now, all right? So enough on that. But not every feeling of anxiety we have is a disorder, right? And because of the current state of our world, even our nation, especially going into election time stuff, we live in just a general atmosphere of anxiety. So we need to be aware of it. We need to be able to react appropriately. Now, anxiety often leads to one of two coping mechanisms, worry or avoidance. And neither of them are good options, okay? So it's just kind of a bummer situation for you there. Right now, worry and anxiety tend to go hand in hand, but worry is not anxiety. Is not an emotion. Anxiety is the emotion. Worry is the way we try and cope with it. Worry is described as a chain of negative thoughts about bad things that might happen in the future. Worry is not helpful for coping. And I want you guys to understand that worry is controllable. Right? It doesn't mean that we're supposed to suppress it. We actually should listen to our worry. We should thank it for the cautionary tale that it's telling us. Right? We should try to recognize and work on the emotion, though, behind what's driving the worry. Right? Sometimes I write out my worst case scenario. If I feel anxiety and worrying about stuff, what's the worst thing that could happen from this? And then I give it a percentage of chance if it's going to happen. Most of the time, it's a very small chance because there's a million options that could happen. And I write, if I could solve it before I even get to it, I write down, here's the solution, right? If there's nothing, I write down, well, what can I do if that happens? And if that's nothing, just move on. It's not always easy. I know that the words sound easier, but honestly, just writing it down and being the chances of this happening is pretty low, almost just removes the worry from your body. Because again, our emotions and our feelings and those things are here to tell us something. They're not here to drag us down. Our body doesn't want us to die. Our body wants us to live. And so these emotions and these things that we feel are just trying to convey something to us. And once we acknowledge, okay, I'm worrying about it because of this, I've wrote it down, your body's gonna be like, all right, well, he figured it out, he's figured out the problem, and it stops. Right? And so don't ignore it. When we suppress it, it builds because it's it's not listening to me at all. I gotta try harder now. And so give it a time of day. Acknowledge it and then move on. The other thing we do to cope is we avoid things, right? We don't show up to what we perceive as giving us anxiety, right? Or we instead spend a lot of time zigzagging around trying to avoid the thing that we feel is consuming us or giving us anxiety. We have to recognize that avoiding things is not benign, right? It causes hurt. It hurts you when you're avoiding the things that your body wants to work through. It hurts the people around you when you're avoiding situations that's not real. And all it really does is increase your anxiety when you avoid it because now you're always worried about running into it. Sometimes it helps in the short term. You're I haven't had time to process, and so I'm not going to go to that thing tomorrow, but I don't plan to miss it forever. I just need to, get this quick break. That's sometimes okay. Now, there's other feelings, emotions that we have to be aware of here that sometimes get confused and mixed into anxiety. Did you know that excitement is actually really, really similar to anxiety. They're two sides of the same coin. If we perceive that the unknown ahead of us is positive, our body releases the exact same stuff as it does when we're anxious. And so sometimes we're actually just excited about something in the future. Something is still a little uncertain. We don't really know how it's going to go out, but we're excited for it. But we're telling ourselves it's negative because it feels like anxiety. And so sometimes you just need to pause and be like, is this something that I'm actually looking forward to? Like, this could be a good thing in my life? You're probably excited. You're not actually anxious. And then you can treat that a whole different way. Because when I'm excited about something, I'm a lot more happy than when I'm anxious about something. And so recognize those differences. The positive versus maybe feeling more negative towards the future. We also can feel dread. Dread occurs frequently in response to high probability negative events. Right? Its magnitude increases as the dreaded event draws near. The "you are here" arrow for dread is if anxiety and worry has you feeling negative about a real event that will be happening in the future. Something you actually know is going to happen. Anxiety is like, this could happen. Dreading is like, no, there's a real thing that is going to happen that I'm dreading that specific thing. And that's how we know the difference between dread and dread. We have to work through it. It's not a perceived threat. It is a real thing. And so we have to handle that differently. Similar in, taking a break and making sure you're resting and handling life around you because you can't keep it from happening. But don't let the dread lead to overwhelming anxiety where you start thinking of things that haven't happened or aren't going to happen. Now, a similar feeling, but about a very present moment, is fear, right? Like Elijah was afraid because Jezebel said, I'm going to kill you. And that was fear. It's present. It was happening for real right now. He got this real threat. Now, fear is negative. It's short-lasting. It's a high alert emotion in response to a present perceived threat. It's similar to anxiety, that some people are more prone to experience fear than others, but it is, a present thing that is happening. Now, Elijah was experiencing a lot of these things. It says Elijah was afraid after hearing the threat of Jezebel, but Elijah was also carrying a burden that wasn't his to carry. Right? He thought, if Jezebel kills me, there's going to be no one left to live for the one true God. Therefore, no one left to fix the world. And so that's what he kept expressing to God. I'm the only one left. God, don't you understand how serious this is? It's just me. If I die, the whole thing goes to kaput. And he was carrying the burden of what God's supposed to be carrying on himself. He was worrying about a future that hadn't happened. Right? He wasn't going to die. It's just thinking about this opportunity is a chance that is there. He was avoiding what he was supposed to be doing. God had already called him to do things, but he was out hiding in the woods. He was believing a lie that he was the only one left. Right? We had already read about Obadiah, who said that he saved 100 prophets in these caves and was taking care of them. There was all the believers who had just started to follow God because of what happened on the mountain. And then God reminds Elijah at the end, he goes, I'm going to preserve another 7,000 prophets who've never worshiped Baal. You're not the only one, Elijah. There's 7,100 and plus people that have never bowed to something else. Right? He was trying to remind Elijah that he was in control. I am going to preserve these people. It's not up to you, Elijah. Elijah was anxiety spiraling, full of dread about what he needed to do. But God spoke truth into him, right? After he rested, after he fed him, after he gave him a break from everything. Both our fear and our anxiety need to be understood and respected, perhaps even befriended. We spend so much of our lives just trying to avoid it that it stays there because, again, it's just trying to tell you some information. Right? You need to pull up a chair and sit with them, understand why they're showing up, and ask ourselves, what is there to learn from this? And sometimes we can't do it by ourselves, and that's why we need a professional. But dismissing fear and anxiety is not useful. Right? It's just as dangerous as choosing to live in constant fear and anxiety. In the New Testament, after Jesus had come and he died and he rose again for our sins, a follower of Jesus named Paul wrote this letter to some churches in Philippi. And so in Philippians 4, 6 through 7, we find this verse. It says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything. By prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let all of your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." This is a crazy opportunity we have, right? It is the deal of a lifetime to take your anxiety and give it to God, and he will take that and he'll give you peace. That is a trade that is always welcome. But we have to do that. We have to go and present it to God. I love that, people stopped at that first part of that verse a lot and it just says, "Do not be anxious about anything." And they're like, you're not a good follower of God if you're anxious about anything. But actually, this verse says, be anxious in everything. Is really what Paul is trying to say. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything. Right? So what he's saying, be anxious about everything correctly. Take it in prayer. Take it with thanksgiving to God. Let your requests be known. Right? So sit in your anxiety and say, God, why am I feeling this way? What is in my life that's causing me to feel anxious? What future event, what perceived threat in the future is bothering me? And then take it to God with thanksgiving, right? Because we've talked about this verse before. We should consider all suffering an opportunity for great joy, right? So we go, God, I'm thankful that I have this opportunity to grow that's before me, but it is stressing me out, right? Give me a broom tree to sleep under. Give me some snacks. Give me a nap. Whatever I need so that I can rest, so that I can handle what's in front of me. And God will give you a peace that goes beyond your understanding. Because again, most of our anxiety, our overwhelm, our stress comes from things we perceive, our understanding of the situation. And God says, I want to give you peace that goes beyond what you understand. And not just any peace, but a peace that will then begin to guard your heart and guard your mind. Paul continues speaking in verse 8. It says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think of things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice all you learned and received from me, and everything you heard from me and saw me doing. Then the God of peace will be with you." Right? I love it says, keep putting it into practice. Right? It's a practice to take your anxieties to God. You're not going to get it perfect every time. You're probably not even going to remember to do it the first time. But you go with prayer, you go with gratitude, keeping your peace, right? Keeping your mind fixed on the right things, true things, excellent things. And if our thoughts are fixed on those, right, you can't be filled with worry and negative thinking. It says, then God of peace will be with you. And lastly, vulnerability is another emotion we can feel at times of uncertainty or of risk or emotional exposure. The many things that give us anxiety are really hidden in the fact that it leaves us feeling vulnerable, right? Sometimes we feel anxiety because we feel vulnerability, right? And we don't want to be exposed, right? It's either going to make us do something that leaves us vulnerable or has already left us vulnerable. Right? Vulnerability is the quality or the state of being exposed. Right? Sometimes it's like during times of giving or receiving feedback, you feel vulnerable, so you're anxious about that situation. Maybe it's getting up to bat again after striking out. Right? Maybe it's waiting for results from the doctor after you had that test. Maybe it's because you need to go apologize to someone and it's going to leave you vulnerable. Maybe it's just even talking about your emotions. Feels like this is so exposed. So you feel anxiety. Maybe it's getting back up and trying again after a panic attack or being overwhelmed. Now, while these things are uncomfortable and difficult experiences, there's no evidence that they're indicators of weakness. In fact, that's one of the biggest myths of vulnerability. Brene Brown and her researchers have found that across cultures, most of us were raised to believe that being vulnerable is being weak. Right? That if I have to leave myself exposed, I'm being weak because I should be protected at all costs. Now, this puts an unresolvable tension inside of us Because while we were raised to believe that being vulnerable is weak, we were raised to believe that being brave is important. There's no courage without vulnerability. There's no being brave without vulnerability. Courage requires the willingness to lean in during times of uncertainty, of risk, and emotional exposure. Elijah had to face vulnerability to get out of his anxiety, out of his stress and overwhelm. Right? God directs Elijah in verse 15. We've already read it, but he tells him to go. He gives him a list of things he needs to do, involving anointing 2 new kings. Right? I'm sure Ahab and Jezebel, the woman who's upset, isn't going to like that Elijah's going out to anoint new kings. And I'm sure that caused more anxiety. I bet that felt exposed. He actually tells Elijah, go back the way that you came. Right? If you know anything about running from people who want to kill you, right? You don't go back the way you came. Right? That's the trail that they're following. But that's directly where God tells him to go. That's leaving him exposed. But in verse 19 of 1 Kings 19, it says, so Elijah went. To me, this is some of the most powerful words in the entire Bible, guys. Because if you've ever been completely overwhelmed before, if you ever been to a spot where you thought anxiety and stress was just keeping you from being able to do anything, you understand how hard it is and how vulnerable it is to get up and go again. I don't know where you guys are at in life today. I know that in this season of life for me, I've been living through a lot of stress and moments of overwhelm, and even coming here this morning and getting things put up and getting ready, there was more issues, and it just felt like that level of, I don't really know if I can handle all the things that are coming for me this week. But I also know that God has called me to do things, and often this is what I have to remember, that Elijah went. And God took care of everything. Elijah didn't die. Jezebel died. God wiped out the problem completely. He everything that he said he was going to do, he did and more. And so often I find myself coming in here to even Sunday mornings just having to remember that. God has called me to do a job here. And this is what I have to do, and I'm just going to do it, and he's going to take care of all those things. So I don't know if you're feeling any of those feelings that Jesus, that leaves you overwhelmed, but I do know that Jesus is here to trade it for peace. Maybe you just need a nap and a snack today, right? Maybe you need to practice getting your mind fixed on more positive, truthful things. But I can promise that you will need to be vulnerable, and you will have to go again. Because God doesn't leave us sitting still. He's never called us to that. He has such great things for every one of us that he is going to call you to go and to get up and do what he's called you to do, to get past it. It doesn't mean that he doesn't recognize where you're at, that he's not going to come and take care of things. But he needs you to get up and go. The good news is we're not doing it alone. Right? Besides this room full of amazing people here that want to support you and love you and help you through those things, we have Jesus. In Matthew 11, Jesus literally promises and says, come to me, everybody who's weary and heavy burden, right? If you feel overwhelmed, if you feel stressed, if you feel you can't handle the things of life, come to me and let me teach you. Take my yoke that's gentle, that's easy, and find rest. God understands that you need rest, and he wants to help you find it when you come to him. And he'll give you a life that is easier to carry, that is light. Like Elijah, we're all going to find ourselves at moments of stress and overwhelm and anxiety. But God offers us peace and rest if we come to him. So if you can recognize the you are here arrow pointing at stress or pointing at overwhelm or anxiety or vulnerability, maybe fear or dread, remember these steps, right? Rest and nourish your body. I think some people struggle with that because they're like, no, I'm supposed to go to God first, right? I have to be spiritual about these things. But God literally, from when Elijah was overwhelmed to when he started to speak to him, was 40 days. But in that 40 days, he fed him, he let him rest, and things. And so first step, rest. Eat something. Secondly, trade your anxiety for peace through the acts of prayer and of gratitude. Third, reframe your thoughts to focus on God's truth and his promises about your life. And then take small, courageous steps forward, trusting in God's plan. Now, maybe you're here and you've never chosen to follow Jesus, and you're like, I need that. I want to trade my anxiety for peace. Right? And you want to give that a shot. Romans 10, in the Bible, 10 verse 9 tells us that all it takes for us to believe in God and to have access to this ability to trade and to come to him is to believe in him. It says that if we believe in our heart that he is Lord and we confess with our mouths that he is Lord, we will be saved. Right? So today, all it takes is for you to make that decision and choose to follow him. In a moment, I'm going to pray, and I would just encourage you, if that's you, to pray that prayer to God. Say, God, I believe that you are Lord, that Jesus is Lord, that you died, you rose again for me. And then begin to just tell him all your anxieties and trade it for peace. And then if you did that today, on the Connect card in front of you, there's a box that says that you made a decision for Christ. And you can check that and turn it in at the Resource Center. And we have a book that we want to give you to help you know what it means to walk a life that as a Christian. But, man, God has such a better life for us if we can recognize where we're at, take the appropriate steps to get back to the peace that he offers us, right? And then be able to live from there. So I'm going to pray, and if you're getting baptized or helping be with baptism, you can head out to the hallway, and we'll be jumping in the pool here real soon. So. That's nice. God, we just thank you that you're a God who offers peace, that this trait of anxiety, of stress and overwhelmed, all the bad things that we feel are so negative in our life, God, that you say, I'm willing to take them and replace it with something you can carry. I'm willing to take it and give you peace that's going to guard your hearts, that's going to guide your minds, that's going to go beyond our perception of the life that we have, and help us to be able to see that we can handle it because we have you. God, I pray that you would help us to have eyes to recognize where we are when we're feeling these emotions, and that we'd have the ability at least to take that first step to find rest. God, and I pray that you help us to see it in other people, that when we see that they're overwhelmed, that when we see that they're living in high stress, God, that we'd be a people who'd be able to take some of that burden and let them find rest. God, before we even begin to try and help them through the things that are stressing them out, that we would just give them rest. God, I pray for anybody who's struggling today, God, right now in this moment, God, that you would trade their anxiety for peace, that they would walk out of here ready to rest, ready to be able to just enjoy you and enjoy the life that you've given for them, and that you will handle the things that are coming in the future, God, because we know you will. It's your promise to us. We thank you so much. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, I pray.